If you're coming out of the winter and into the summer and it's all drying up and getting hard packed, or maybe you're going on holiday to a place like this and you're coming from loamy tracks and you're hitting the rocks, it's going to be a bit of a shock, isn't it?
It is indeed. Here's a few tips on how to set up your rig for these conditions.
First thing to consider is your tread pattern. So that is what these little sipes and teeth look like on the outside of the tyre. Now, if you've been used to riding mud and loam, you might have something that's quite spiky, and that's because it grips by digging into the ground. However, if you're riding on a lot of rock and dry terrain, then the spikes might actually sit on top of the rocks and the hard packed terrain and give you less surface patch, less contact patch with the ground. And actually that will be less grippy. So you might want to switch over to a tread pattern that's for dry or mixed or rocky terrain. The next thing to consider is the compound. So for example, I've gone for a Mazda here, which is just the model name of this Vittoria tyre, and that gives me this tread pattern. But on top of this, we can talk about enduro or downhill or even race compounds. So for example, the race is a tacky compound, and that will be lovely and grippy on rocks, but do consider that because it's softer, it may wear out a lot quicker. Another thing to consider is trail versus enduro. So for example, an enduro or a downhill casing can be a lot thicker, and that means that it'll take harder hits because you might actually be riding faster when you're in the dry terrain. And also the rocks can really hit your rims, so having a thicker casing can actually offer you a little bit of extra protection. Not to mention that when you're going faster into those dry corners, something with a thicker sidewall will give you more support, but also puncture protection. And finally, think about your tyre width. Now, I usually run 2.4s back at home and certainly on my trail bike, but as we are met with some really rocky conditions here, I've gone for a 2.6. So the wider tyre means a bigger volume, and that means I can run slightly lower PSI so that it conforms over the rocks and gives me a bit of extra grip and cushion. But if you are a fast or a hard rider or a heavy rider, then you might want to consider tyre inserts just to protect your rims with that lower PSI.
I don't know if it's just me, but when I hit the big mountains, when it gets really rough, my bike feels absolutely rubbish. Now, because it's all set up for soft ground, loamy sections and dodging some trees. So I tend to set up my suspension, which is really important. Now, I literally speed up the rebound front and rear, so it kind of reacts with all that ground, hitting those rocks at high speed. Also, it makes the fork and the rear shock recover a lot quicker on this terrain, so it works a lot quicker and easier and makes the ride a lot smoother. Also, it helps with geometry, especially when it gets a little bit steep out, because it will help keep it up. Now, if your holiday is more about hitting humongous jumps and bike parks and drop-offs, then you would find yourself diving through your suspension. You don't really want to be having high speed rebound on front and rear because it's got a tendency to buck you over the bar. So you would keep that a lot firmer. But when it comes to the rocky sections, it's cool to just hit a bit of a trail twice or three times, stop about midway and adjust your clicks, both clickers, by 2 clicks, and then go for a ride and find out if that's enough, stop again, adjust it. It's the fine tuning that's gonna make your fine rig ride a lot nicer over some rocks. Now, there's 2 types of suspension you can get, and that is coil and air. As you can see, I'm running a coil on the rear, and the coil just reacts a lot quicker to the rough ground. It tracks the ground quicker, especially when it gets a lot rougher. This thing can dissipate heat a lot easier. Now, with the air one, after a long descent, that can start to heat up on the air suspension, and it can start to stiffen up. So there's something to consider. When you're riding rough stuff, the coil reacts with the ground a lot nicer than the air.
Now, I appreciate not everyone can afford to buy a second set of wheels, but if you go on holiday a lot and you're considering buying a second set just for going away and preserving your current wheels for best, then here are a few things that I would consider. So first up, I would consider the material of the rims. Now, I personally would go for alloy for this sort of style of wheel because carbon is great and a lot of companies offer a crash replacement policy nowadays. However, if you're in the middle of nowhere or you're on holiday, you're unlikely to be able to get that crash replacement. So carbon, if it cracks, it's a fail and you're not going to be able to ride them for the rest of the week. However, alloy is more likely to bend rather than catastrophically fail. So in that instance, a lot of the time you can bend it back, or you can at least run a tube in that wheel if the sealant isn't sticking. Another thing I would consider is going for conventional spokes, like a J-pull and a normal nipple, something that you will definitely be able to find in most bike shops if you break any. And go for as many spokes as you can. So I'm running 32 holes here, because the more spokes you have, the stronger that wheel system is. And if you were to lose one or two, it won't make a massive amount of difference. And if you're going to be running those wider tires on holiday, then do consider you might need a wider rim. So if you run in 2.4 to 2.6, for example, you're going to be looking at a 30 to 35 mil internal rim width. And finally, let's just talk about size, because I am a massive fan of mixed wheel sizing with the 27.5 on the rear. However, I've definitely been on holiday in Madeira, cracked a rim and found no replacements whatsoever because everyone is running 29 these days. So if you have the option of switching up to 29, then you're more likely to find spares, in my experience.
Now, if you're out there riding some gnarly exposed tracks, you'll find that you run out of gears really quickly, more so than you would be at home. So I would consider taking a spare chainring or two. So ranging from 30 to 32 would cover you on that base. But if you're going to be doing a lot more pedaling and not using the uplift, consider it being a lot harder with a bigger chainring on the front. Now, when I go on some big pedaling holidays where I'm climbing a lot, I'm going way out there into the mountains, I actually shrink the ratio to about 28 on the front, which will cover me there, which is pretty key. It'll save your legs, it'll save your knees. And also, I'm not going to be finding myself bombing down some crazy descents at high speed when I'm so far away from civilization. You also find that most riders will be free coasting over crazy rocky terrain. You won't be pedaling like an absolute madman. Now, I haven't given you much advice, but there's things to consider when you're riding rocky terrain, and that would be a few things that you need to add to your bike to protect it. Now, a chain guide, just like this one right here on the front, is going to help protect your chain. It's going to help your chain from bouncing off on that rocky terrain. Also, maybe a rubber or a bash guard underneath here to protect the frame from rocks flicking up. Also, maybe a steel chainring just in case of those rocky accidents. The key thing is to protect your frame, because it is going to be rough and stuff is going to be bouncing everywhere, especially your chain. So having some chainstay protection, if your bike doesn't come with it from manufacturer, buy one, add it to it. It just softens and dampens that crazy rattling noise when you're going down the trail. Also, it protects your nice paint. Another one is a derailleur, because this is pretty close to those big rocks. Now you can see I have quite a premium derailleur on the back, which I'm pretty nervous about when it comes to riding the rock stuff, because this right here is really expensive to replace. So I would take a spare one, or when I'm at home, I'd probably stick on something a little bit cheaper. If I'm going to be riding super rocky terrain, take your nice Gucci stuff off and put something else on there that's a little bit more affordable if you're riding somewhere where it's super rocky. Another tip is crank arm. Now, this is when you're pedaling up a rocky ascent like this one behind me. This point right here is really close to those rocks. So I would consider buying crank arm end caps like these here, just to protect you from strikes on a big rock. You don't want to be damaging these beauties, especially if you are running carbon, which you don't want to damage anyway. Now, the one thing I would like to consider is that it's pretty much an upgrade. If you're riding rocky terrain quite a lot, maybe get a shorter crank arm. Now, I'm running a 165 on here. I did run a 175 or 170. Now, Anna has opted for a 155. She's gone from a 165 to a 155, which for obvious reasons, is for an inseam. Like me, I've got a shorter inseam, so that will help. But also when it comes to rocky terrain, it just brings that part of the bike further up into the bike so you don't get those pedal strikes.
So by contact points, I mean everything that comes in contact with your bike. So grips, saddle, even pedals. And these things are small, but they can make a big difference to your comfort. So for example, on my grips here, I've leveled up from an enduro grip to a downhill grip, as that gives me a little bit more vibration damping. Sometimes you might want to move from a lock-on grip, for example, to a full foam grip. Something I do on XC all the time, because removing that inside collar means you get an extra 1 or 2 millimeter of foam, which is nice and comfortable on the hands. And then over to the saddle, I'll always go for a metal rail rather than carbon, as I tend to be hitting the terrain a lot quicker, and sometimes those G-outs can really slam you down onto the saddle. So say a steel on the enduro bike or the downhill bike would be great, and if you must save weight on the XC bike, then go for a tie rail instead of carbon.
Brakes. Now, riding technical terrain over long distance on those descents, these beasts right here on the front and the rear can overheat, because you're going to be using them a lot. And when it is hotter, they'll overheat a lot quicker. Now, you don't want that, because they can underperform at best or even fail. So here's a few points to consider. So tip number 1 is rotor size. Now, the smaller the rotor, the quicker it's going to overheat, and you're going to lose a lot more power and performance. Now, put in the biggest size rotor that your bike can take. For me, I've got a 203 on the front right here. With a 4-pop brake, this is going to give me a lot of stopping power. Also, the size of the disc means that it can dissipate the heat a lot quicker. Now, for me, I'd like to put in a 203 on the front and on the rear when the terrain gets really gnarly and hard, like steep. Also, another tip to point out is when it comes to the rotors is floating rotor. That means it will dissipate that heat a lot quicker than one of these standard rotors where it's just a solid item. Also, when it comes to cooling down those brakes, is get these vented floating discs as well. That's just going to push the air through it and cool it down a lot quicker. Another thing to dissipate heat is in your pads. Now, you've got these cooling fins on the pads right here, and this is a perfect one to regulate that heat. Keep it at a constant temperature when you're riding your bike, because you don't want these to heat up either. But when it comes to pads, I tend to run a sintered pad, which means it will take longer to heat up, but they last a lot longer when you're out there riding big descents. When you're riding a resin pad, it kind of tend to last me a couple of days, and then they'll start to fade. Perfect for those short rides where you need to get the heat in the pad quicker with the resin pad. But when you're riding those big long ones, a sintered pad is one to look out for.
Oh, you could spend the earth, couldn't you? I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of money, but if you've got some cash to splash, there's some other things to consider, is maybe swapping out your half lid for a full face. I mean, you can get enduro full faces these days that are a bit lighter and have ventilation as well, eh?
Exactly. What is cash when your safety is at hand? Now, when the terrain gets really rough, like the Mega Avalanche that you can race, I go with a chest and back protection for those really bad ones. But that's for a short day. If you're going for a mega long day, some backpacks can offer back protection within the backpack. Backpack.
Good point.
Yeah.
And I always go with knee pads. You can't go without knee pads on terrain like this. And sometimes I have been known to fall on the old elbows. So if you're one of those guys, then you might want to think about elbow pads just to give you a little extra confidence about crashing.
Yeah, and if you're riding a lot of rocks, which we're going to be doing, robust shoes, because they are close to the floor. Them tootsies of yours, you don't want to be stubbing them in the ground. Get some sturdy shoes.
I know. Well, speaking of shoes, should we hot-foot it down this trail?
Oh, yeah, please.
All right, lead the way. If we've forgotten anything, then let us know down in the comments below and help out that GMBN community.
You ready?
Let's go.
I'm ready to rock and roll down this.
Go on then.
Literally rock and roll.